During the pandemic, uh, FDA tried to be as transparent as possible, and of course, there's limitations because of confidentiality with drug applications that FDA can't put as much out there in the world. I think as
Right.
we'd like, but we really did try to meet people where they were, and I think actually, the virtual platforms have been really helpful because they allow for engagement where people aren't in the same room. They allow for patients to engage with the agency where they might not have been able to make it to DC, to White Oak in the past. So I think that's really important. Transparency, advisory committees. We held advisory committees for um, many of the decisions around the vaccines. That is not only an opportunity for expert input, but also an opportunity for transparency around FDA.
Today's guest is someone who's been at the very center of U.S. drug regulations during some of the most consequential years in FDA history. Today's guest is Julie Tierney. She was the former chief of staff for the FDA, where she oversaw agency-wide operations spanning approximately almost 20,000 employees in a multi-billion-dollar budget and helped to steer the FDA through some of the most complex regulatory policy and public health challenges. Julie played a central role in shaping and implementing landmark health legislation, including, I'm sure you've heard of it, the 21st Century Cures Act, and multiple PDUFA reauthorizations with deep involvement across Congress and federal stakeholders. Julie holds a bachelor's from Johns Hopkins University and her law degree from Georgetown. She's now a principal at Levitt Partners, advising life sciences companies and patient organizations on regulatory strategy, FDA engagement, and navigating the evolving policy landscape at the intersection of innovation, science, and public health. Julie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you today because there's so much going on, especially in 2025, this last year in healthcare. And the FDA has been at the center in the news about a lot of stories related to drug development and science. So definitely, I'm very interested to get your take and your feedback. Now, one of the things that struck me about your background is you're an attorney by training. So tell us, how did you end up at the FDA?
Yeah, so I think I'm probably one of the only 12-year-olds who looked at their parents and said, I want to go into science-based policy legal work. So,
Okay. Not many
yeah,
12-year-olds think of that. That's true. Okay.
yeah. So I knew sort of I had a passion for science growing up and was good at that. I was fortunate to have some great role models in my life. My grandmother was a doctor, um, and sort of was encouraged to pursue that path. But on the other side of my brain, I knew that I enjoyed writing and advocating. And so I thought, like, this is a great sort of non-traditional path for someone interested in being in the middle of scientific developments, but also leveraging those skills. So when I did my undergrad, I double majored in biology and history, knowing that I was intending to go to law school and thinking I wanted to be an environmental lawyer, probably. This is sort of the 90s and the like idealism around saving the planet. When I graduated from law school, I ended up at a boutique food and drug firm. Didn't know that was a type of law that people practiced at the time and fell into it and was like, this is what I was intended to do with my life. So really fortunate to have had that happen early in my career. And then did that work in private practice, moved to another law firm, and honestly, when I paid off my student loans, had the call of public service, and FDA happened to be hiring attorneys at the time. They had a hiring freeze, so that kind of worked together, and I ended up starting at the FDA as a staff attorney, working on counseling the drugs and biologic centers on a wide variety of issues. So that was sort of a great introduction to the agency. Got exposed to a lot of really interesting issues towards the 2008 uh, onward. So really felt very passionate about my work at FDA. Really enjoyed that transition from private practice to the public sector. Doing legal work is great, but then I also sort of had this pull towards more proactive work, and I really enjoyed with my clients having the opportunity to work with physicians and scientists and really problem solve with them from the beginning rather than being called in at the end to clear their, their various policies or letters or whatever, and sort of enjoyed that collaboration, and ended up doing a lot of work in the antibiotic pipeline space with some physicians in the Center for Drugs, and thinking about what FDA could do to encourage the development and judicious use of, the development of new antibiotics as well as judicious use of existing ones. And that gave me sort of a taste of legislation and working on that negotiation process.
I was going to say, so it sounds like, you've done a lot of different things at the FDA and you've been, really working at the highest level. What do you think is maybe the biggest misconception that people in pharma or biotech or just in general have about how FDA decisions actually get made?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that folks tend to underestimate the amount of everyday tough decisions that are made at the staff level without involvement of office leadership or center leadership or the commissioner's office. And I should put the disclaimer in that this is based on my almost 17 years at FDA and sort of how things happened when I before I joined the agency. And so every day there are hard decisions being made. There are review staff that are working on issues. Traditionally, it's not been effective to call either the commissioner's office or the center director's office. Those offices have generally acted as a buffer against sort of political or favoritism decisions, right? So take those requests and then maybe talk to the staff, but really have a deferential view to their decision making because they have the data in front of them. I think the other thing that folks underestimate is sort of the number of individuals that are often involved in a decision. And so it can seem like it takes a very long time, but from my perspective, having those different views and those different folks touching the decisions really helps to make sure that you've got a durable decision that's got backing of your leadership, that's legally viable, and as I said, durable. So I think sometimes decision making can seem like it takes too long, and certainly FDA can always improve on that. But having those number of hands touching it, I think really provides a more robust decision making process.
So it sounds like the misconception is that people think maybe the FDA commissioner has more influence on some of these decisions than maybe they do. Because, when an FDA commissioner gets picked and that's announced, it makes a lot of news, obviously. But it sounds like you're saying a lot of the things that happen day to day are really more dependent on the larger staff, and that really it only goes to the commissioner if it's something politically related or something that's really kind of high level that can have maybe more, I guess, widespread effects from a policy perspective. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's traditionally the case, and certainly commissioners come into their office with priorities. Sometimes those get sidelined by current events. I work for Rob Califf, and he came in for his second term, really wanting to think about evidence generation and Abbott the Abbott case and the infant formula shortage happened like the first day that he was sworn in. So that sort of sidetracked issues. You've got drug shortages, other sort of emergency things that happen. But that's right. Certainly, traditionally, when commissioners have come in, they play a large part in what kind of policy initiatives the agency is putting forward. And it makes sense that a political appointee with ties to an administration would sort of bridge that gap and think about perhaps branding or signaling where FDA is going in line with the rest of the administration. Traditionally, that's happened with consultation with career leadership, career staff, thinking about what the FDA is doing, what's within its purview, and sort of what levers FDA can effectively deploy in order to move policies forward. And that was my experience when I was in the chief of staff seat, as well as when I was an attorney, and before that, when I was a member of the Food and Drug Bar.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, obviously, as you know, Marty McCary now is heading up the agency. And there's been a lot actually happening this year in 2025 in terms of the FDA in the headlines, at least more than I can remember in a few recent years. One of the things that's come out is their change in requirement for approval around clinical trials, requiring a single pivotal trial. And then the other thing that came out was around the National Priority Vouchers, the NPVs, and to try to help speed up approvals. And I guess there's both positive and negative feedback on both sides, right? Some people are like, this is great. This cuts through a lot of the red tape. We need to speed up drugs that patients need. But others are worried that this could potentially pose a risk to patients. And I'm just curious, given your time there and your experience, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think certainly um, FDA does generally feel a sense of urgency, particularly around unmet need. When I was at the agency, when I was working in the Center for Biologics, particularly around rare diseases, we felt that to our core. Like these are things that we need to move forward as quickly as scientifically feasible during Operation Warp Speed. The same with the vaccines, but I think doing it in a sort of very deliberate and um, uh, science-based manner was really important to us because we wanted these decisions to be durable, to allow for reimbursement and access for patients. I think the number of changes that are coming at folks from the agency, it can be overwhelming at times, and I think it's important to take a step back and to think about what the actual framework is, to talk to folks who have a knowledge of what that underlying framework is, and think about how it will be implemented to the extent we can predict it, right? So the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher Program, there have been some questions about its legality, both in terms of the FDA creating it and whether it's applying a different standard. And I'm not in the discussions at the agency, obviously, but I do think that in terms of durability of decisions or reimbursement for those decisions, to the extent it suggests a lower bar, that is potentially concerning. I think with the one clinical trial requirement, just noting that's been in place for several decades in the FDA law, the alternative to have two adequate and well-controlled trials or one trial and confirmatory evidence. And in fact, the majority of the drugs that are approved by both CDER, Center for Drugs, and CBER, the Center for Biologics, are approved on the basis of one trial, one clinical trial, because they're either a supplement or because they've got sort of mechanistic data or farm tox data or other information that you can sort of extrapolate to only rely on one trial. I do think that commissioners, certainly it's within their purview to sort of virtue signal where they'd like to go. And that can often be a prompt for further guidance or for implementation. So for this sort of default to one adequate and well-controlled clinical trial, I think it's important to take a step back, think about, how much of a change is it? And also, to the extent that it is a change, recognize that this is going to need to be implemented through policy, through internal communications within the agency. Because remember, as I said, these decisions are being made on a day-by-day basis by review staff. Not every letter goes through the commissioner or through leadership.
Right.
And so that's going to have to be communicated and implemented throughout the centers before it actually sort of, quote, takes effect.
You brought up a really good point around reimbursement. As you know, the number one reason actually for care delay in America is prior authorization denials. It's a big problem. One of the things that we do at our organization is we actually credential all the prior auth and reimbursement specialists in the country, and it's a big issue. Patients can get access, especially a lot of biologics, that are really expensive for these patients. They can't get access to it. And you bring up an interesting point around if there is a shift in terms of what data is required to get an approval. I would imagine payers may push back harder, right? Because they're pushing back to begin with because these drugs are so expensive. So I think that, we'll have to wait and see kind of how that all plays out. But I think that's a really important point that maybe people aren't thinking about. It's kind of that market access, patient access perspective. Um, Now, you played a really big role in implementing the 21st Century Cures Act. So maybe for the folks that aren't aware, what is the 21st Century Cures Act? And then maybe looking back, how do you think it impacted ultimately drug development, real world evidence generation, and maybe did it deliver ultimately on the vision that you guys had initially?
Yeah, I think it did. I first became involved in the 21st Century Cures from within the agency, working as legal counsel, and I was one of the key negotiators for it. And then was really fortunate that I had the opportunity to go down to the Senate Help Committee to negotiate it when it was being considered in the Senate. You know, as I mentioned, I'd been involved in some of the antibiotic pipeline work, and there are some key provisions that ended up in cures around that. Also, the regenerative medicine provisions. I think those really reflected the moment in time, that 2015, 2016 time when we were really seeing the emergence of, cell and gene therapies with the development of the CAR Ts, development and approval of the CAR Ts, and then we saw some gene therapies in 2017, 2018, sort of
Mm.
really the pipeline, though, not just the approved pipeline, but the amount of products under investigation. So I think that regenerative medicine provision was really important. I think having real world evidence provisions codified within the act, I think that's often very important for FDA to where they develop policy, but to have sort of the congressional endorsement of this approach and the requirement to develop a framework. Another provision that we were really felt was an important part of this was the drug development tools qualification program, which was really intended to sort of raise all ships, so to speak. So you've got biomarkers and clinical outcome assessments, and having FDA qualify those so they could be used across different applications without companies having to submit it time and time again. That has not led to as many drug development tools being qualified, I think, as we envisioned. And a patient advocacy group did a recent analysis of that. So I think, in terms of further legislative action, whether it's the reauthorization of the user fees in 2027, or Cures 2.1, 2.2 efforts that some in Congress are talking about, it really will be important to look back if any of those policies need to be refined. The important, I think, element of the Cures Act was thinking about research at NIH and how that feeds into the drug development process and the regulatory work at FDA. And then I think going forward, though, as we talked about, reimbursement and access is so important. So that's going to be probably a very important part of any efforts under the Cures umbrella going forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing that you were involved in that. Such a big piece of legislation that definitely had a huge impact. Let's talk a little bit about public trust. As you know, especially I think post the pandemic, uh, the public has been concerned about, what's happening in not just pharma, but also on the agency side. And I think that's shifted a lot in the last 5 to 6 years.
Mhm.
And I think especially with social media, there's so much information out there. You don't know what's real, what's not, who to trust. What do you think, from your standpoint, the FDA can do differently, if anything, to maintain or improve its credibility and trust among the American public moving forward?
That's a great question. I think that um, in terms of maintaining trust, right, it cannot be a reactive or responsive effort. It really has to be something that you build over time. Um, and we worked on it a lot, and obviously a lot of room for improvement. But during the pandemic, uh, FDA tried to be as transparent as possible, and of course, there's limitations because of confidentiality with drug applications that FDA can't put as much out there in the world. I think as
Right.
we'd like to, but we really did try to meet people where they were, and I think actually, the virtual platforms have been really helpful because they allow for engagement where people aren't in the same room. They allow for patients to engage with the agency where they might not have been able to make it to DC, to White Oak in the past. So I think that's really important. Transparency, advisory committees. We held advisory committees for um, many of the decisions around the vaccines. That is not only an opportunity for expert input, but also an opportunity for transparency around FDA's decision making. When I was chief of staff, we took a page from that and really, when there were controversial decisions, tried to make sure that the approval decisions, the memos from the staff that outlined their reasoning, were posted very close to the time of approval so they could be
Yeah.
referred to as a resource rather than us trying to recreate it through statements. I think another thing that lawyers and scientists and doctors need to get better at is speaking in plain language, because in my experience, it's great to have a lot of different viewpoints at FDA when you're driving towards a decision, but you can end up with a red line document that in the end you're like, could my mother understand this? No.
Right.
And everyone's got to get their viewpoint in. So I think it's really important to be transparent, plain language, and the other key to that also is not just transparent but predictable. That's another key element. So it's not just transparent in the moment, but also thinking about what type of advice and messaging is coming out. And I think that the industry, patients, all parts of the ecosystem really depend on a more predictable FDA. That's to everyone's benefit. And that has been, I think, a matter of great concern over the past year. Sort of, are there winners and losers being picked? Can you rely on advice that was given a few years ago in terms of clinical development? And so that's where I think transparency can help, but it's got to be tied to this sort of predictability as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. Transparency is huge. So years ago, this is going back, gosh, almost probably over 20 years ago, 25 years ago, actually, I worked at Merck. And I was at Merck during the Vioxx debacle, if you remember Vioxx. And that was a big issue. It was like, they weren't transparent with the data. If they had just come out and talked about the data and were honest, but they had hid the data, allegedly. And it created a lot of mistrust, unfortunately. And, the negative of that is that, it's one bad apple, but it ends up tainting an entire industry. I'm a big believer. I say this all the time. I worked in the pharmaceutical industry for many, many years at the highest levels. And, overall, the people working in the industry want to do good. They want to do the right thing. But, you always have a few folks that are unfortunately, unethical. Talk to me about the critics that say FDA is influenced heavily by the pharmaceutical industry. There's a lot of concern about that, in the last 2 or 3 years, especially around, I'm not going to name the company, but one particular company. What's your take on that? Is that true that, the FDA is really biased and influenced by industry?
I don't think so. And I think because I was in a number of different positions in the agency, in the commissioner's office, in the chief counsel's office, in a center, I think I can speak from experience to say that the folks at FDA that I interacted with from the staff level to the highest level really view it as very important that they are independent from sort of influence of the pharmaceutical industry. And I know that with the user fees, some folks feel like that's a pay for play situation,
Right,
but
right.
it really was important to make sure FDA had adequate staff, moving from 3 years for an approval decision to 6 months and under in some circumstances. But that is not removed. That is far removed from the decisions that are being made. No one is thinking like, well, Merck paid this user fee. We better get this decision in for them, right? It is, I think, part of FDA staff, sort of their ethos. They're incredibly mission oriented, driven towards protecting the public health, promoting the public health through the efficient development of drugs, biologics, and devices, but really think of themselves as independent. And I think there's actually probably any number of folks at the agency that really take that to a further extreme and consider it sort of an adversary relationship. And I don't think that's helpful either. But I think FDA is very independent, top to bottom, from pharma. I do think that there's some information sharing and education that needs to happen. Like they're humans, as you said. Most folks in industry want to do right. Most folks at FDA want to do right. Patients certainly want access to help with their lives. So there's a lot of good intention there, and sometimes the information sharing is important, but I don't think that it's undue influence. I think that it's really important for FDA to understand technology, understand data, but they take great pains to make sure that they maintain their independence, or at least in my
Yeah,
experience when I was there.
and I want to talk to you later about that too, about the technology and AI side, because obviously a lot's happening there. But just on that note around, transparency and trust and making sure that everybody's operating at the highest standards in terms of ethics and credibility. In the end of the day, it's important as well. So at the ACMA, our organization, the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs, we developed a framework for medical science liaisons, for example, that go out and talk to doctors, the pharma sales reps, even the reimbursement professionals, so that they're meeting these high competency standards. And we do that through board certification, accreditation of these folks. I'm a big believer that you need to have a standardized system where you ensure everybody's level set and uniform kind of meets these minimum competency standards. Given everything you've seen, in your experience and where we're going to, I think, as a society in terms of greater regulatory scrutiny and accountability in this area, how important do you think that is when it comes to communicating with healthcare providers?
Yeah, I think that's very critical. There's, it's talked about a lot of information coming from a lot of different sources, and separating that into what's really meaningful and what's noise, is critical. And so having communications that fit within a certain framework so that they're neutral is incredibly important. And I think because of sort of the chaos that's happening within institutions writ large, sort of accelerating this year, we're often putting the ultimate decision making on providers, on patients, to look at all the different sources of information. And so, to the extent that we can help them with a neutral information and sort of that they can find credible and view as a resource for decision making, where they might not be able to look to traditional sources, I think that's really important.
Yeah, I agree. Let's talk a little bit about data and AI. Obviously, this is changing things quite a bit. Now they're saying with AI, you can shorten drug development timelines significantly. What do you do around policy with AI? Talk to me. I mean, I guess with the work that you're doing now and your firm, how that's coming up and, where you see things going when it comes to AI in the life sciences space.
Yeah, I think there's, I think it's helpful for new technology like AI um, or gene editing, for example, to, think about these as tools, think about whether they fit into what is a pretty broad legislative framework, um, and then whether there are changes to regulation and policy that need to be made. Um, I think folks should not be afraid of AI. I have to admit that, like, my comfort level, I, have to work to make sure that I um, understand it as well as I can, since I am somewhat technical, but not entirely. But it's touching, every aspect of it. So, using AI in, as you said, in drug development in terms of predictive modeling to perhaps replace or augment animal models, animal testing,
Mhm.
to identify drug targets. All of those things, those are tools that certainly are going to replace people, but really we need to figure out how we can leverage in a predictable way, and one that can be sort of the protocols and other things can be shared with FDA. And I think FDA is really trying to make sure they've got the expertise to keep up with these types of technology, because you've got AI and regulatory decision making as well. So you've got to sort of on the development side, perhaps the evidence, reviewing evidence, to the extent you can use it there. I know that there are companies that are using it for perhaps to help them with their medical writing, for submissions to improve them. But I think you always have to view it as augmenting and improving rather than doing the work for you. And then on the FDA side, the same thing. And one of the things that I, think about in terms of using AI in regulatory decision making, I think we've all heard the tales that FDA deployed some ELSA, an AI tool that was hallucinating, and the reviewers felt like they couldn't rely on it. But you know, how is FDA using AI in regulatory decision making to the extent that it can be trained on submissions and prior decisions. That's great. But as a lawyer, I think about sort of what that means in terms of proprietary data. And is that the best, how exactly do you go about doing that without sort of using proprietary data in ways that weren't imagined before? I often, when I was in the chief counsel's office, would think about sort of this super reviewer who had seen all the files and, could they sort of collate that all in their brain and come up with the best advice for new sponsors. And I think that's where everyone would benefit from that type of engagement. AI could be that super reviewer, or at least help an experienced reviewer with finding examples of different approaches. So I think you've got to be open to learning about the science, open to what it can do right, what it can do wrong, and think about how that can fit within an overall framework that's as predictable as it can be.
Yeah, I was thinking about the FDA reviewers, and I was thinking about how if you have AI, right, well, we know now AI, can be trained now to be smarter than a board certified, physician specialist. Um, what would that be more objective, right? Human beings, we come with certain biases, although the AI models themselves have biases as well, depending on how you train them. But again, I just wonder from even just from a review perspective, if you'll be able, to your point, to get the reviews much more efficiently and get an outcome that's the most objective as much as possible. Because as humans, we all have our biases. It'll be interesting to see what happens, and I guess how that gets regulated. I have a simple question for you, and I'm not sure if you know the answer. How does an FDA commissioner get picked? How do they pick them?
Maybe like, is there a conclave with like white smoke?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was thinking like, from what I know, Bob Califf, like, so Bob Califf, for example, I remember him when I worked at AbbVie Pharma. Now at the time it was Abbott, now it's AbbVie Pharmaceuticals. He was, a physician thought leader, for example, back in the day. Marty McCary, from what I recall, he hadn't, I didn't have any experience working at the FDA. So how do they decide, that this is going to be the commissioner?
Yeah, well, I think that there, as you said, like generally there are some thought leaders and there's some like perennial names that are in the mix, depending on the political party in power. Um, I think, and because it's a political position, and there are not that many political positions, or in the past there have not been at FDA. There's been anywhere from like three to five generally,
Mm,
which
yeah.
is for agencies at that size not that many. And maybe they're more, give or take. Chief of staff sometimes are political. I was a career. Same with the chief counsel, and then sometimes it depends on the administration. The number of politicals may expand. But I think that sort of the bench for FDA commissioner, and perhaps because there aren't as many political appointees, I think we could do better with strengthening the bench so that every time there's a change in administration, we're not sort of like looking around and thinking like, oh yeah, there's like three names that are always around. Like, could we be developing our future leaders? But as there is this difference between sort of the career staff development um, and then the political uh, head of the agency, right? Even the principal deputy traditionally has been a career appointment. And I was chief of staff for Janet Woodcock, who was acting commissioner for um, I don't know, 14 months, which is like a pretty long term for for an FDA commissioner, acting or not. I think she was sort of a unique situation where, definitely very career, came up through the Center for Biologics, Center for Drugs, and was acting commissioner. Ultimately not nominated, and of course I think there's like this vetting process that happens for any of them, and sometimes you get recurring commissioners because they've already been through the vetting process, right? They've already turned out skeletons in their closet. So, um, yeah, I don't think maybe that's not an answer. But I think there's no one that's like this is the person and that's all. There's definitely vying that happens, and
Yeah.
uh, but I do feel like repeat names come up time and time again.
Yeah. Yeah, I ask 'cause I'm sure, people just wonder, it's just out of curiosity how those names come up. You really haven't heard of these people, and then bam, all of a sudden they're the commissioner. Um, I actually had the pleasure of meeting Janet Woodcock. I met her up at the FDA campus in Bethesda. She was fantastic. We talked a lot about standards and things like that, and she was a big supporter. She's great. Um, all right, last question. So for people listening out there who are interested in building a career at the FDA and kind of following in your path, what advice would you have for them?
Um, Great. Yeah, I think right now, it's very uncertain times for folks that want to enter into federal service. I'm
Mm,
just going to acknowledge that.
yep,
And I definitely hear that from younger folks, because it's not as predictable and stable of a career.
sure.
I think when I joined the agency, bringing the skills that I had to bear after being in legal practice, I found such connection with the mission and passion that folks that I work with felt that that folks should expect if they come to FDA, they're going to want to work hard, and that those around them work hard. Um, and Also, coming from any sort of background, FDA needs folks that do a lot of different jobs. So I came with a legal background, project managers, folks that work on admin issues, and doctors, scientists, and really knowing that that is tied to the ultimate mission. I think really it moves forward a lot of folks. And so, I wouldn't feel limited if I were someone interested in service at the FDA. I wouldn't feel uh, limited in my background because there's just a lot of different positions that they could have. I think one of the really rewarding things about working at FDA is seeing real life impact. A product is approved or not approved. A policy is put in place that like facilitates a whole pipeline. And on the foods and sort of the diversity of issues as well. I know we're focusing on the medical products, but also FDA regulates most of the food supply, and
Yeah.
and does so from with very limited resources, and sort of from a post market setting, right? Things aren't necessarily cleared and approved through the foods program. So sort of the wide range of issues and being able to move around the agency, really, it's an amazing career if folks are interested in it. And I think it's important to be open to it because it's an opportunity to really make a difference.
Yeah, and like you said, a lot of people that are there are really mission driven. I think that's really important because you're right. The decisions that the team makes have, big ramifications across the country and really across even the world. A lot of other agencies that I've worked with, in my career, they look to the FDA, as kind of that North Star. So I think that's really important. Julie Tierney, it was great having you. A
Thank you so
lot of
much.
great insights. We'll make sure to put a link if you'd like below to your firm. People can learn more. But it was great. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for coming on.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Julie.